What is happening, you beautiful bastards? Welcome back to another week. This week, we have a fantastic guest for you, Shavaun Scott. And she has something that's probably a little too near and dear to Americans' hearts, but it really kind of hits the whole world. Yeah, she's talking about the minds of mass killers.
And specifically, her new book, The Minds of Mass Killers. And in this episode, we actually talk about the concepts in her book. Things like some common misconceptions about mass killers and mass shootings, things like that. You know, what she's discovered they all have in common, or what they aren't like. You know, what is the mental state of a lot of these people. A lot of things that don't really get covered in the news, because what you see on the news is a lot of hyperbole about the shooting, not really about the killer.
Yeah, we kind of go over all sorts of things, and the fact that almost all of them, if not all of them, she can see the traits before they even happen. So hopefully everyone learns something here, and maybe, going forward, we can have a better world.
I hope so. This is a pretty serious episode. I think you guys should give it a listen, give it your full attention, because it's a big problem, especially in the United States. It's the first step to fixing it.
What made you get into, what made you decide to write the book?
That's a really good question. I get asked that a lot because I look like a fairly benign, normal, suburban person. And it's like, why did you write a book on mass killers? I have been a therapist for 33 years, doing psychotherapy in Oregon and California. And most of that time has been in private practice, and the focus has probably been more on victims of crime or victims of abuse and violence in some way. But I've also had a concurrent, really interesting professional history with people on the wrong side of the criminal justice system. And going back to my very first case as a clinician in the mid-'80s, I was in my 20s at the time, and my very first client was a murderer who was out on parole. And I worked in a drug treatment center at the time doing therapy. And since then, I've had many interesting opportunities as a member of community mental health and the state of California, working on multidisciplinary treatment teams, usually as the person doing the actual hands-on therapy, with people who were everything from murderers to bank robbers, and criminally insane. So people who were hospitalized with severe mental illness. So basically, a really fascinating, long career. And I know a lot about the topic because of that. And I'm always interested in forensics. And in 2019, there were 3 killings back to back, literally a couple of them just within a few hours: Dayton, Ohio, El Paso, Texas, and Gilroy, California. And I'm very active on social media, and all the buzz on social media, people were just, upset, as everybody is when these things happen. But all the myths and the information that was getting shared, and even information that was shared on CNN, it was all wrong about why people do these things. And I was just fed up enough. I first thought, let's make a documentary about it, but then that got really complicated. So I just sat down one day and in about 15 minutes wrote an article that I put on Medium about the myths and the facts, just some really short, basic things. And that got quite a bit of attention. And a couple months later, I got an email from an editor at the publishing company saying, would you write a book on this for us? So
that's cool.
I wrote an outline and signed a contract and got to work.
Cool. It almost seems like you got into it for what I believe is probably a reason that we keep seeing these things, at least in America, is we all have a fascination for understanding why it's happening and why it's so bad in the States.
Yeah, definitely. And everybody wants it to stop. And that was, a couple of the myths that I get upset about, because I go, we can do something about this. One of the myths, the first one, is that it's senseless. And you hear this on the news all the time and in the press. It's senseless. It's senseless. It's not. It makes perfect sense if you understand the mind of the kind of people that do this. They have a whole rationale, and it's very logical. So if you understand the reasons, it's not senseless. And then if you understand what the reasons are, just from a public health perspective, it can all be prevented. You just have to have a plan and some very specific things that you do. And so, I would see things like, there's nothing we can do. This is just the way we have to live now. This is America. We're just an awful place. And that, to me, is frustrating, because I know we can do better. And in working with people who have committed crimes, that's one of the things that you come in with in treatment, is leading up to what were all the steps in your development and in your life that caused you on that day to make this decision that got you incarcerated or got you in the institution here. And so you want to break that down. And so that's my way of looking at these things, is like, we can always break them down and look at points in the past where something could have interrupted that pathway.
So is there a pattern between all of these people who are committing these crimes that you're seeing, that they all have?
Yes, very much. Yeah, what we're noticing is, particularly since Columbine in 1999, the incidents have been happening more frequently. They're moving out of locations. We used to talk about people going postal or school shooters. And I just use the term mass killers because we're talking about concert venues, hospitals, Walmart, the
Literally
grocery store
anywhere.
in Boulder, anywhere. And so really the dynamics are the same with the perpetrator, no matter what the location is. But it's usually a person who's angry, usually male, usually but not always younger, who's on a vendetta against society and wants to go out into a public place where there's a crowd, where they can kill as many people as possible. And usually the people are strangers, but they have a symbolic meaning. One of the other things that is happening, particularly in the last 5 years, is that dramatically more of the incidents are motivated by extremist hate, or racism, gender violence, or ethnic kind of hate.
So because we have the mass killings rising, and they are tied back to basically not liking groups that are different from you, does that mean that kind of racial and gender hate is also increasing?
I think it is increasing. And I think everything that we read, the sociology and political literature, with the political unrest that we've had and the polarization that has been increasing. I'm reading right now Stephen Marsh's book on the next civil war. And I think a lot of the things he says are the exact same things I've been saying and have said in my book. But I think there's great evidence that we're at a really precarious place politically. Some of it having to do with internet and the way that we all find our bubbles on social media and then become these self-reinforcing groups. And it's just polarizing, this whole us and them thing. So I think there are more young guys who are angry, who have certain personality traits, that are online. And if you want to use the term radicalized, that's part of the process of what we're seeing.
Now, one thing that I have noticed as just an average American who's been watching this on the news, we've had one mass killing in Connecticut where I live, but generally they are distant from me. So I don't know a lot about them other than what I see on the news. But one thing that I have heard in conversation when people talk about this is, and obviously you just said that this is not true at all, is that a lot of people think that the frequency is not more than it used to be. We just hear about it more.
Yeah,
now,
that's not true.
Right. I just wanted to point out that that's clearly not true after talking to you. But do we know, is there an exact trigger that we can point to say this is why it's happening more?
No, there's never one particular thing. It's one of my favorite words is multifactorial, because with most big problems in humanity, it's always a lot of things that come together in this kind of synergistic confluence. Right now, we've got, as I say, a lot of social discord, political discord, precarious times economically for people who aren't doing well in a lot of different ways. You throw on a pandemic and the collective stress on the society is higher. So I think, here in my community, we've had a lot more crime, a lot more gun violence of all sorts. So I think there's just a lot of different things that come together. We used to hear, oh, it's all violent video games causing this. I think the Senate actually held hearings after Columbine, to try to ban video games. Well, if that were true, you'd be seeing mass killings in Korea and Japan, because every country in the world, people are playing video games and they're playing the same video games. And so clearly it's not that, but it's a lot of things that come together.
Actually, I was in, what was it, my junior year when Columbine happened. Right. And I mean, it seems like there's a lot of people who are, they're almost martyrs to them. They keep them in this high regard. Yeah. And they want to reenact it to a degree. And it's
very much. Yeah. Some of the other interesting things that people don't understand are the two effects that are very closely related, copycat and contagion. And copycat is when people actually model their behavior after somebody who's come before them. And the copycat, documented copycat killings based upon the Columbine incident, there's, I think, over 50 or 60 now that have just been entirely based upon trying to copy those two guys. Contagion means people get the idea because they read about it or they see it in the news media or they see it in, certain internet groups on 8chan or wherever. And because there's this tendency among certain groups of people, particularly adolescents, to do what other people are doing. And it becomes a model. I call it the template. And it's kind of the United States template for what you do with anger and when, your life isn't going well. And we've been exporting that to other countries. And we had one in Germany just this week at Heidelberg University, where a student who had a grievance of some kind, and we don't know all the details, but he left a voicemail message to his father right before he perpetrated the killings and said that everybody is going to pay now. So that's the classic American mass killer kind of template.
Were there any signs beforehand with that one?
Yeah, I don't know enough about that case. And the German press is probably, well, apparently, at least at this point, either they don't know much or they're not as sensationalistic, perhaps, as our press, because usually over here, which is unfortunate, is we do tend to over-focus on the perpetrator to the point of, as you say, sometimes it becomes a role model. And the other thing I say is for every one of us that looks at a news story and says, well, that's horrible and that's horrifying, there are people out there also watching who go, well, that's really cool,
Yeah.
I've heard even certain platforms where they won't mention excuse me, they won't mention the names or show pictures or anything like that.
Right. In my book, I mention a lot of cases as case studies to illustrate the psychology that I'm explaining in the book, but I don't use anyone's name. And that's one of the principles that came out of the FBI's work, is that fame seeking is a huge motivator, which gets into the personality types of people that do this. And the more that they see photographs of the perpetrators and the more they read about their lives and their stories, they start to identify with them. And so it's called the don't name them campaign, so you can talk about the crime, talk about the place, the incident, the motivators, but don't give attention to the killers.
I like that idea. We're going to have to work on that in this one. We'll have to edit to make sure that happens. But I mean, if you look at, I think it was Oxford, there was a lot of signs beforehand. Some were paid attention to, some were not. Do you see that there's a lot of signs beforehand normally?
That's a great question. Yes, the signs beforehand are called leakage, and almost always there's some amount of leakage. In often cases, it's glaring, like putting videos on YouTube saying I'm going to be the next school shooter, or describing exactly what the plan is. social media posts, posing with your, automatic weapons and talking about things with your friends at school, writing stories. But people often assume that that kind of leakage is a joke, or, oh, well, he's always been a weird guy, so, don't take it serious. We need to always take it seriously, because leakage is the greatest predictor of a future violent event. And we can never assume that just because somebody, has been saying those things for a long time. Well, some people plan for years before they actually do anything. So it may have been something that, in the Sandy Hook case, the guy had been writing about violence both in line and in school since 5th grade, and had actually written a horrendous series of stories when he was in 5th grade, one of them involving murdering mother, a boy who murdered his mother, and just horrendous violence in the stories. And so those kinds of things are incredibly meaningful. And yes, we need to pay attention to them. That's one of my points, is that always pay attention to it.
It almost makes you wonder, like, I want to say it was maybe up until the 80s, serial killers was a thing. And they were hard to catch, where nowadays you don't hear about serial killers too much because everywhere is being filmed. There's literally, you can't walk without being on film at all times. And I'm wondering if they're just shifting over to this now. So instead of, I'm going to act out slowly and kill as many as I can, but do it in secrecy, now I want to hit as many as possible, one shot, and just get it done with.
We can never say that that doesn't happen, because, weird things happen and who knows, but there's a different offender typology. Serial killers, there's a strong sexual component with them. Yeah. And with the public mass killers, it's more generalized. I'm angry at, Hispanics. I'm angry at the Jews. I'm angry at women, because they identify with the incel culture, or it's kind of a different thing. So the serial killer, I would say, is a really different kind of offender. But could somebody do both? Sure, theoretically possible.
Now, that brings up the same, or another point, though. Why are they all men?
Isn't that a great question? That is a great question.
What's wrong with us?
I know. I wish I had the answer to that, but believe me, everybody's been batting that one around forever. 90% of everybody incarcerated for violence is male. And 98% of mass killers have been male. There were just a couple of women. And I would think it would have a lot to do with the fact that just men in general, up until what I would call recent, are not very good at dealing with feelings. Yeah, I think our model for masculinity has a lot to do with that. The sense that, who do kids look up to? They look up to action heroes, or, there's always some kind of power or dominance theme involved. Even in really benign television and movies, even small problems are solved with firearms, and I think it's confusing. I raised 2 sons, and they're great guys, but why? And they never went out for aggressive things. I think they had a nerdy mom and a nerdy dad, and they just never went for guns, had no interest in football or any of the more aggressive kinds of things. But I think for a lot of kids, they're struggling with, what does it mean to be a man? Do you go in the army? I mean, how do you prove your worth as a man? And it's a hard path. And I think that's part of our looking at intervention, catching things earlier before people start fantasizing about violence, how to help people feel comfortable with who they are, and as you said, learn to talk about their feelings and learn to have resources and healthy friendships, because bottom line, well-adjusted, happy people don't see mass murder as a solution to anything.
Well, I hope we're turning a page on that one. It seems that we, in the past 20 years, we've changed quite a bit on what, men are opening up more. They're able to talk about things more. They're being seen as, oh, you can have feelings and that's okay.
Yeah.
So hopefully we're taking a turn on that, but it doesn't seem that way. But from what you're saying, it's just mass murders getting worse and worse and worse.
Yeah, I think it's a confluence of things. You know, we've got more weapons in the population than we've ever had before. And the stats on people arming themselves, whether they're certainly the far right has been armed for a long time, but even people on the far left, because everybody's worried about civil war, you know. So people who have never had guns before have bought guns in the last few years.
Oh, yeah.
I think that's part of it, because accessibility, one of the reasons, I mean, I'm sure in other countries where you don't see mass killings, or you see very few, there are angry young men there too, but you don't have the firearm accessibility that you have here. And that's one factor.
Now, when we're talking about your book, you break down in the book the pathway to violence.
Right.
You just reminded me of that when you were talking about your last point there. Can you kind of break down for the listeners what your research tells you about that?
Definitely. Yeah, it's fascinating. And the pathway to violence seems to be really consistent. One of the myths is that people will say, well, he seemed like an okay guy, but he just snapped. He must have snapped. And it never happens that way. It always starts with a phase. The first phase is called the grievance phase. And this is where a person begins to focus on all the things in their life that are wrong, or all the things that are unfair, and start to tabulate that, almost like keeping a scorecard. And there's a little bit of a paranoid flavor with mass killers, sometimes a very paranoid flavor, that during the grievance phase, they start to externalize blame, so that everything going wrong is the fault of other people. And often these things are very benign slights. You know, maybe one girl that they have a crush on doesn't reciprocate, and that turns to all women, you know. So it's this kind of paranoid way of looking at the world and accumulating grievances. People often do that for a lifetime. I mean, you may, sometimes when I talk about that, people say, oh, I know people like that. And it's like, we also call them, an FBI term, injustice collectors. It's like, it starts to become a theme in their life. Everybody's doing something to me and I'm really pissed about it. Yeah. And then after that, the second phase is fantasy. And this is where violence starts to look like a good solution to all the grievances. And the fantasy phase may go on for weeks, months, or even years, sometimes decades, you know, but that may be the angry guy who says, I'm just going to go to work and shoot everybody someday, you know, or whatever the target. I'm going to wipe out the alien invaders here in Texas, whatever. So the fantasy becomes more violent, more specific. This is often when people become enamored with other mass killers, or they start Googling and they end up in groups online where everybody's talking about the Columbine guys, or people are focused on Manson, or people become amazing how much the Nazis still permeate youth culture, you know, and this kind of fascination with them. So the fantasy phase gets a bit more specific, and sometimes people then move on to planning. Now, a lot of people never move past fantasy. Yay for that, right? Yeah. But the ones who progress move to planning, and that's when they get very specific. And they often start buying weapons, or they start experimenting with bomb making, reading things online. They affiliate perhaps more formally with hate groups, whether it's people that they know in person. You know, most people just affiliate online these days. You may never meet a KKK member, but you can find them all over the internet. Mm-hmm. So they, sometimes then that's when you'll see the leakage. They start writing stories. It comes out in their writing or their music. If they write songs, you start to see these themes, and it gets way more specific. And then the final phases are breach and attack. And that's when they've set the date, they've arranged to, maybe they know where the security guard is. And so they plan, I'm going to take out the security guard first, or I'm going to enter under this other door. And then it moves into the attack. So sometimes those two phases go right together, and sometimes they're spaced out a little bit more.
Now that's I can kind of see that in like the news reports, because, you know, when they report it for months at a time.
Right.
So the people who commit these mass killings and then they don't kill themselves, they get apprehended. Have you had the opportunity to talk to them, or maybe read a lot of the interviews to get an insight on on what they thought about it afterwards?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I have read so many interviews, FBI reports, investigations, watch videos, and interesting. I mean, you can watch, probably it's on YouTube this week, the one of the more notorious killers was in Norway. The guy that there, I believe it was 2011 or 2014. I need a spreadsheet to keep track of everybody. But he killed like 77 children of a his political party that he did not like, because he's a racist and he didn't like the party that was allowing immigrants in. So he went to an island where the children were all at a summer camp, and he wiped out, I mean, he shot hundreds and I believe killed 77. So he wrote, I remember, I think it's 86,000 word manifesto that he spent 10 years writing about his rationale for doing this. And one of the reasons was because he wanted to testify in court about his plan to run all the Muslims out of Norway and out of Europe, and it was to return to this white society. And he just this week has been in the news again because he's come up for a 10-year review, which in Norwegian law, apparently every 10 years, people who are incarcerated in prison get a review, a judicial review of, are they making any progress, or, you know, how are they doing? Yeah. And so he used this occasion again to come into court, give Nazi salutes, and say that he regrets nothing. And that's not uncommon, you know, to hear people say that they feel they were justified. I mean, a lot of them, over half, go into this planning to commit suicide or believe that they're going to be killed by the cops during the incident. So they believe in this ideology. Their personality has kind of gelled around this, and in their minds, it's worth dying for, which is really hard for normal people to wrap our heads around, that people can become this way. But
you got to be really into a cause to be like, yes, I will sacrifice my life for this.
Yeah. And especially when you're 17 or 18 years old, you know?
Yeah, there's a lot of anger when you're 17 or 18 years old, though, too. And it just that all that hormones going can really fog your judgment.
Yeah. What do we say? The best crime prevention tool is a 30th birthday.
Yeah, I wouldn't doubt it.
Let's get the brain fully baked and people think a little better.
Now, another thing that I've noticed as well watching the news, again, I really haven't done any research on this because I'm just a spectator in the United States. A lot of it comes down to, and it seems to be more with white perpetrators than anybody else, they immediately go to mental illness, which I can see that being the case, but with modern society the way it is and the ability to end up in these echo chambers, I don't know that necessarily it's always mental illness as much as, you know, what we talked about a couple minutes ago, just a slow buildup over time. Do we know about what that kind of what that ratio looks like? Are there actually a lot of people who are having mental issues that are perpetrating these things?
That is a wonderful, wonderful question. It's a huge portion of my book explaining what mental illness is and what personality is, and the difference between the two. Because only about 10% of mass killers, this has been studied extensively, have a severe and chronic mental illness that causes delusions, hallucinations, something where they really don't know what they're doing. I mean, they have a rationale, but it's based on something completely not real, you know, so they're hearing voices. The person that shot Gabby Giffords in Arizona, he was classic in a lot of ways, but he was schizophrenic and he was hallucinating and really should have been hospitalized quite a bit of time before he ever got his hands on a gun. So, but about 10%. So that's significant. Another 20% have some kind of significant mental health problem. But that still leaves us with 70% who do not have a mental illness per se, nothing that we could identify. I mean, maybe they're moody, they're adolescent, maybe they have some depression, but it's not a severe mental illness in any way. So what that leaves us with are factors of personality that are different for certain folks that come together in a cluster that results in dangerous behavior. Now, a lot of people have these personality factors, but I can talk a little bit about those if you want me to.
Absolutely.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Okay, so the first one is paranoia. And this is actually something that in psych testing we can measure, how paranoid in someone's thinking are they? And folks who have paranoid tendencies tend to be suspicious, they tend to be angry. They tend to view other people as always doing something to them. And as I said before, that can be completely fictional. They may be misreading, the room all the time and think that people are slighting them or snubbing them when that's really not what's happening.
I think
So
we've all known people like that.
Yeah, we all do. We may have them in our families. And so that alone, I mean, it's a really difficult personality trait. And when people come into therapy and I see that, I try to work with them on that. There are other ways to look at this other than somebody's doing something. Now, I mean, there may be a time a boss really is out to get you, but often people are misperceiving. So they've got the paranoid trait. And then the second one that we find is narcissism. So they really want to be famous. They really want to be special. They want to be known and recognized as a superhero in some way, even if it's for murder, better to be infamous than to be nobody. So they like feeling powerful. And narcissists also tend to be very aware of slights. And that kind of ties in with the paranoid tendency. So those two things go together. And then the third in this kind of perfect storm is psychopathy, or how we get the term the psychopath. And that's a person who really has no conscience. They don't typically feel any guilt if they do harm to someone else. They can be cruel and they can be very manipulative. So they can be up to all kinds of things and fool people. So when you put those three things together, that's kind of the core of what you see, not only with mass killers, you see it with people that have been labeled as domestic terrorists or suicide bombers. Those are kind of the three things that seem to recur in a pattern. Now, there's a couple of other things that are added on. One is Machiavellianism, and that's a person who's incredibly manipulative because in some cases, like the Columbine guys, they were in a counseling program the year before they, did the murders. And they were released early from the counseling program because they were such nice kids and were doing so well. And so that shows this really incredible ability to lie and maneuver. And I also call it impression management. They know how to make people think that they're just really good guys when they're not. And you see that a lot, of course, with successful criminals, some politicians.
They're usually very charismatic.
Yeah, charismatic, and they can manipulate and they know what to tell people and they brag about that. And the final one is sadism. And I have tried in my book to not go into too many horror stories, up close, but I do talk about some enough because I think we need to understand that there's a sadistic element here. This is not often just not somebody shooting off at a crowd in the distance. This is very up close and killing little kids up close. You have to be a very unique kind of person to find pleasure in that. And yet they do. And so when you put all those things together and you have access to semi-automatic weapons and you have a culture that celebrates violence and aggression, it's not a mystery why we see this.
No, not at all. I mean, unfortunately, it happens all too often. And it almost seems like we don't even have an answer of how we can stop it.
Yeah. That's the hard part. My longest chapter in the book is the final chapter, chapter 15. And that's where I try to go. It's probably a long chapter for people to get through, but I go through this laundry list of what are all the things we can do. And I say, of course, I think all the therapists who research this, the sooner we can interrupt the pathway to violence, the better. And that's something I think everybody can do. If we know young people, kids, make sure that they're well supported emotionally, that they're connected, that they have a healthy, balanced life with healthy friends and activities and things that give them joy. that they're not just falling into, 12 hours a day online on the internet, isolated in hate groups, So that's certainly the upstream thing is prevent before people go down that dark path.
Unfortunately, though, it almost seems like the people who would need to pay attention to that, what you just said, will never pay attention to it.
Right.
I mean, like if you look at Oxford, like those parents
Right.
would never have listened to, like, yes, we need to support our child and listen to them and talk with them and everything else. Instead, they just kind of like, yeah, whatever, oh, here's a gun.
Yeah, here's a gun for your birthday. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you're right. And that's,
so how do we get those people to listen and to think about it?
I know that's the frustrating thing. I think the more we can help schools, help teachers. I have so many friends and clients who are teachers, and teachers are just struggling to keep up with the kids who need help right now. If we can support mental health therapists and get more mental health folks in schools, my God, I mean, there's such a need,
Absolutely. Especially, I mean, anyone who has kids nowadays who are in grades around those ages, like there's a lot more going on than when I was in high school. And
oh my God. I mean, yeah. And I'm glad I raised my kids, in the 90s. So before we had, smartphones and all the things kids can get into. Working with kids now, the things that they're into on the internet. Oh my God, you guys. It's confidential, but if parents knew everything their kids are up to, they'd be horrified. And
I know some people who they don't even have any, like, you can control your kid's phone. There are ways to do this. Now, I agree there's a fine line there of going too hard or too light, but there's some people who just don't even do it.
They don't do it at all.
Don't even attempt.
They don't do it at all. They have no idea that their 12-year-old daughter is communicating with 50-year-old men and sexting. And yeah. It's horrifying. So parents, even in the families where they are trying to do a really good job, and that's not all families, parents get really stressed, they get busy, illnesses happen, COVID happens, financial problems. And so I think if we look in this country, where do we want to put our money? Again, back to that, if we can support the schools and help the teachers and give teachers smaller class sizes, because really, I think teachers are angels. I mean, they care about the kids for the most part.
They're way underpaid.
And they're way underpaid. They're under-resourced. And so many of the good ones are stressed out and leaving. I can't tell you the people I've seen that are wonderful teachers that love kids and would really be a resource for a troubled kid, and they can't take the stress and they've left.
We've talked about it on the show before, and I actually have a buddy who's a high school teacher, and he loves teaching, absolutely loves it, and you can tell he loves it. But he has to have a job on the side where he's the contractor, because otherwise he couldn't survive. He couldn't support his family. Yeah. And so he works ridiculous hours. Yeah. So he can still be a teacher. And they have to buy their own supplies, everything.
It's making them ill. And even when teachers notice red flags, let's say in third graders, fourth graders, fifth graders, there's no one that they can go to, and if they try to talk to the parents, and as you said, there are parents who just don't care or validating, the hate-filled extremist stuff, unfortunately. We don't have mental health people in most schools, and we have some academic, the school counselor deals with academics. They're not there, and they're not usually not trained to work with mental health issues. And so I think that if we want a safer society and we look at, what's one thing we could do is invest more in schools, in therapy for young kids, and hopefully get them connected on a healthy path in life. Rather than being these really angry young men who just think that, guns are gonna give me power.
Yeah. And I mean, I couldn't agree more with you. Like we need to spend way more funding into education. I feel like they're gonna fight that with the fact that even if you put that in, it won't change the numbers, and it might not, but it'll still be better for the kids,
Well, it'll be better for the kids, and healthier kids ultimately are going to do better in life. They're going to be more successful. Stressed kids, there's actual changes in the brain that affect them throughout their lives. And so the more we can take some of the awful stressors that children are under, the more we can remove some of that, kids will thrive. We will have a healthier society. And I think sometimes you see countries like Finland or these smaller countries, it's kind of apples and oranges because we've got this huge country, but they do schools in a much better way than we do here, and they have better outcomes, so it's more complicated. I totally get that, and nobody wants their taxes to go up. I get that too, but it's all a matter of priorities. Do we want to have a healthier next generation, or do we want to have more kids who are so angry and raged and not quite right in the head that they go out and pick up a gun?
I'd also be curious if there's a big difference. I'm sure someone has a map with all the pins in it of what states have more mass killings, what have less, what's the differences between them. Is it just gun control, or is it a mental health thing? Whether that's positive or negative, it'd be interesting to see the differences there.
Yeah, there is data on that. If you want a resource to actually get into a lot of the data, now it's not all the data because there are different ways of counting what makes a mass killing, and different researchers have all counted it differently. So you get different data. But the violenceproject.org online is a great database for that. And then Mother Jones Magazine has a database. Washington Post has a database. Colorado has had more than what we would consider kind of typical. And that goes back to the copycat and contagion effect with Columbine. And there have been a lot more planned attacks that have been interrupted before they happened in Colorado. I do know that.
You don't hear about the interrupted attacks too often. I wonder if it's just because it's not sensationalized, Yeah,
they're not sensationalized. The FBI, I think, tries to keep records on the interrupted attacks, and that can probably be, you can probably Google FBI data. There's a lot online that you can get from the FBI. You can find out a lot of information, but it goes back to we count things differently. And so in some mass killings, some databases, we're only counting 4 or more deaths. Well, what about if the guy wanted to kill 100, but he was a really bad shot, So that, in my mind, that still counts.
Yeah.
So a lot of interrupted attacks are not reported to federal agencies because they're maybe interrupted by the intervention of a school counselor, and so law enforcement never even got involved, or often law enforcement doesn't report to the federal authorities, which is true for hate crimes too.
Yeah, I'd love for that to become a thing where they'd report it no matter what. And, obviously if the law is getting involved there, they should be reporting it. Because, Jerry and I know that data becomes everything.
Yeah, I think we're seeing a lot of improved data, but people still define it differently. For my purposes, I don't care. I mean, I count the...
it's the intent.
Yeah. The Charlottesville attack with the vehicle where the guy drove into the crowd, I count that. I mean, in my way of looking at things, because he wanted to kill a lot of people. He killed one, but that certainly was his intent, was to kill much more. And that's another trend, is that mass killers are driving into crowds with vehicles. And that's happened in Europe and in Canada and in Charlottesville here.
Are they all premeditated?
Yes, I think most of the time they're premeditated. Yeah.
I'd be interested to see if there were any that weren't. I mean, it seems like they all plan it out because like you say, they're looking for that glory, or they're trying to be a copycat or whatnot. But I'd be curious if there wasn't one that just, all right, today is the day and I just decided to do it.
Yeah, I think often there can be somebody who's thought about violence, they've accumulated firearms, or they've, had a plan, whether it's to drive into the crowd of activists or whatever. They've been thinking about it, and then maybe something happens that really upsets them, and that becomes the day that they do it. But you don't take a normal person. It's like, you guys wouldn't just have a bad day and say, I'm going to go become a mass shooter today.
Yeah.
You might call a therapist or somebody, call a friend,
or a
say,
buddy,
go out for a beer. But it's not like, oh, the solution to this is picking up the gun tonight.
Now, speaking of guns, I've heard a lot of people argue as well that we have an issue with gun control in the United States, but I've heard a lot of people argue that getting rid of guns won't solve the problem because then you'll just have mass stabbings. Now, do you think that there's any kind of credence to that, or do you think that getting rid of the guns will solve a lot of the issue?
Yeah, yeah, it's really hard to stab 20 or 50 people without getting stopped.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, you might stab 2 or 3, and we've seen incidents of that, and certainly I think Europe, and I think there have been a couple things in Japan where people have tried to kill other people, in a large group with knives. So the problem, even with guns, when we had the ban that came in under the Clinton administration in 1994, the semi-automatic weapons ban that was a 10-year ban, mass killings went down, and dramatically the numbers killed in each incident went down dramatically. And that data is online all over the place. And you can even see the graph of that. And the minute that the government under Bush came back in and lifted the ban, and everybody went out and bought their AR-15s, mass killings went up, and the numbers killed. I mean, in 30 seconds with a semi-automatic weapon, you can kill dozens of people. And some of these mass killings, they have not gone on for more than 30 seconds or 2 or 3 minutes, So that's the problem with military grade firearms, easily accessible military grade firearms. And what we see with the gun lobby is increasingly trying to eliminate any background checks,
Yeah. And what did what state just passed as an 18-year-old student, you can carry a gun in a school?
Yeah, that's another thing. It's really hard to monitor all the changes that are happening. But if you remember last summer in Boulder, the guy that went into the King Soopers market with a semi-automatic rifle and killed 10 people in just a minute or something. And he had bought that gun 6 days before in the city of Boulder when the semi-automatic weapons ban was lifted. So a court ruled against the ban. He bought the gun, and then the following week went into the supermarket. So if we did not have the accessibility of really deadly weapons here, would we have some mass killings? Undoubtedly, people would try. They're not going to be very good at it. So
yeah, my thing is, I would imagine if I was in their shoes and I was trying to do something, I would just find another tool. I mean, you look at like the marathon bombing, which was a little bit different case, but they're gonna find a way. Like, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have gun control, because we absolutely should, because there are people who are obviously not responsible with them. And as a state to state thing, absolutely. But they're gonna find other ways, and I don't know if that's the total solution.
No, it's nothing. There isn't a total solution. There isn't like just one thing and then it's all going to get better. There's probably a dozen things, that we can do. But yeah, the bombing thing, that's the other thing about Columbine. We call them the school shooters, but they originally wanted to be the bombers, and they were trying to outdo McVeigh at Oklahoma
and their
City.
bombs didn't work.
Their bombs didn't work. And that's one thing about bomb makers, particularly young adolescent bomb makers, they're not that good. So a lot of times their bombs don't go off.
And I think they had tested theirs beforehand too, didn't they?
They hadn't tested bombs that big, but they had been making bombs for a couple of years.
Yeah.
I just watched a video about that. It was actually more about serial killers. And they specifically mentioned bomb making, and they said really the only successful people who kill people with bombs are like the most intelligent psychopaths. So a lot of people try to use bombs, but most of them have no idea how to make it, and it just completely fail. Which is fortunate for us.
Really good electrician.
That's true too. But now that we have the internet, I'm surprised that the use of bombs is not increasing, because you can just look this stuff up now.
Right.
Well, that's why I wonder where you have the FBI stopping. I mean, if you look up, how do I make a bomb? I think you're going to have someone knocking on your door.
Yeah. Well, maybe. Yeah, I think you can get away with searching quite a few pretty sketchy things on the internet without anyone coming to harass you.
The dark web, at least. Yeah. We hope it's being monitored, but yeah, it's kind of scary.
So, Shavaun, what is it that you're going to be working on next going forward now that you've got the book done and you're getting the message out there?
Well, I hope to keep getting the message out with very specific kinds of target people. I would like to, I mean, it's a goal to connect with every senator in some way. I mean, I know certain ones from certain states are not interested at all, but there are a lot of different groups who, Sandy Hook Promise, I fully support their group, the Violence Project, who are trying to get into schools and help support teachers. And I think we really need to have legislators who understand this stuff better, because I think your average politician doesn't have a very good understanding of it. They don't understand all the factors that come together. And so we hear really dumb things like, well, we're just going to arm the teachers, or we're going to harden the schools more. And it's like, yeah, most school shootings are perpetrated by insiders. They're students of the school. So it's not like you're keeping out some scary entity somewhere. It's like, no, this threat is coming from within. And in fact, in a lot of the ideas that were enacted post-Columbine, the lockdown drills and all of this, we're actually raising a generation of kids now who know exactly how lockdown drills work, and they know how to get around them. And one of the things they do is pull the fire alarm, because when you have a fire alarm, everybody goes outside, and that makes them a target. And so you can't think that by increasing school security, you're going to keep out the scary killers. The scary killers come from inside the school very often, usually.
What's interesting is that you just reminded me, Andy and I both have kids that are in school. My son is in 6th grade, and 6th grade boys, they kind of make everything into a joke, even if it's serious. Comedy tends to be a coping mechanism. And what's really interesting is I'd imagine this doesn't happen in other countries, but multiple times I've said bye to my son on his way to school as he goes to the bus, and he'll jokingly say, hopefully I don't die in school today. And as he walks out, I'm thinking to myself, that's pretty messed up.
It's horrible.
It's very messed up.
It's pretty messed
horrible.
up that's how a kid going to school has to think.
Yeah. It's not healthy. Anxiety is a huge problem for kids. All kids of all ages, the anxiety is off the chart. And I can't help but think, and this is something I also see with kids that I see as clients and with teachers as clients, that a lot of the school shootings, every time there's buzz, another one, if it's all over the news and they hear about it, and then they have lockdown drills, and then we expect them to just go right out of a drill into a math test. And it's like, just turn that off now, forget what we were just talking about. And teachers, I have a dear friend in Texas who's a teacher, high school teacher, and he's afraid when they have a fire drill. I mean, it's horrifying because you never know, is it real, or is this something, has somebody just pulled the fire alarm because they're going to shoot when we go out the door? So
it's also, it's got to be pretty hard to be a teacher when you have that in your mind too.
Exactly. And when you're looking at kids who you see these red flags, and nobody can seem to, you can't get help for them or get a response.
That's the one thing I hope that comes out of Oxford, is that when teachers bring up things, because I believe not only are the parents are incarcerated right now, I believe, and then also they're talking about suing the school, which I don't disagree with, because that, like, everything was there.
Yeah.
Like, all the signs were there. And I understand that hindsight's 2020, but like, what more could they have done there to be like, hey, I'm about to do this, like, let's buy a billboard over on the highway. Like, it didn't make any sense.
Yeah, it's hard to not be angry at the school. I felt that too when that happened. What the heck,
this we've been training for this. We're supposed to answer to this.
Exactly. What we really need in every school, and the federal government has supported it, but the states and the local school districts have control, really, ultimately, over what happens when it comes to having what we can call crisis response teams, or based upon the Secret Service threat assessment model. But this is a model based upon having a mental health professional and law enforcement professionals that work with school staff, so that when a kid is tagged as making threats, there's been leakage in their behavior, things in their writing, this team immediately pulls that kid, has contact with that kid, and then follows a very set protocol on what level of danger are we really dealing with here. And clearly that school in Oxford did not have anything like that. And most schools in America don't, despite the fact that there's a lot of support for that. Sandy Hook Promise is working in that area, and the Violence Project offers free training for schools. So and that's where my thinking comes in with what can I do? I want people to realize there are things we can do, and we need to take advantage of the resources that are there. There's reason to do it because we do have some power here.
I know my state of Rhode Island has a long way to go before it is anywhere perfect or near perfect for school. But I do know that they have a police officer who's there multiple times a day, that all the kids know his name. They work with him. The times that he goes there in a day change. And they also have the same thing, like was it a month or two ago, Jerry, when they had all the schools were on high alert because TikTok put out something saying it was going to happen on Friday.
Yep. Yeah, I remember that.
And all the kids are
They
had some kids that got into some trouble on that day. They were joking around and whatnot. But immediately, nope, they're pulled into the office. The cops talking to them, and immediately the cops can tell whether this kid is, all right, he's joking because he's nervous,
right.
And when he came into the office with the police officer, he pretty much, he shit his pants because he's like, oh God, this is real.
This is serious. Yeah.
So you're like, oh, we don't have to worry about him. And then the other case, but at least they followed something, where in Oxford, they're just, oh, this is shining in our face. We don't need this.
Yeah, exactly. And the issue of having officers on campus is controversial. And people say, why do we have cops in our schools? And okay. I can see both sides on that, but what we know from what we know in data is that if the officer is the right kind of person and has a bond with the kids, then there are good outcomes, because that's the person that kids are most likely to report to when they're worried about one of their friends. They go to that officer. And so you want the officer as your ally in keeping everybody safe.
Absolutely. I'm like, if you watch in the morning when I drop my kids off at middle school right now, like they see them, they're waving them, they're high five and stuff like that. It's obviously there's a buddy thing going on there. More than, authoritarian, like I'm here watching over you, don't do anything.
Right. I'm not here to be the big bad authority figure.
Exactly.
Yeah. And that's really what we want. We need that. And we need then the mental health person that's available as needed on call, that, a kid's really upset, having a crisis, really angry, get the therapist in there, so when you have those kind of teams, you will have much better outcomes on all kinds of violence, gang violence and all other kinds of things too. And when you mentioned that TikTok threat, that was all across the country. We had shut down here in Oregon. I have friends in California that were shut down. That's a great example of social contagion, right? How that just spreads online now. And there's actually a process with the shooters called gamification, where this is what led to the demise of 8chan, the computer message thing, internet, because they had groups dedicated to the adoration of mass killers. And they actually were gamifying so that who gets the top kill score is considered number one, number two, number three. And then there were always these challenges. Can so-and-so do better with the next kill score? And that has been taken seriously by several of the people who went on and perpetrated. So
crazy.
That's the element that I think in modern times, we didn't have before the internet. You certainly didn't have incels where, the guy who's maybe got some pretty serious social problems goes online and meets, 1,000 other guys just like him, where they talk about let's kill all the women,
Yeah.
you didn't have that before. A guy with that kind of personality problem was isolated. Maybe he was angry and unhappy, but he didn't have this network that exists now.
Yeah, and I don't attack the video games very much because I grew up playing them. Jerry grew up playing them, and so far we haven't tried to do anything, and nor does a lot of people. But I do think there is something to it all being like an online thing where you're not in a room with a bunch of buddies.
Right.
You're not having conversations outside of the game. To me, there is a difference there, and we used to have conversations where if someone had a thought that was just on the outskirts of just sane,
Yeah.
you'd be like, your buddies would rein you in.
Yeah. You have a
Nowadays-
difference of opinion.
Exactly.
The grit
Nowadays,
corrects.
that's not
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
Nowadays you're just staying in your clique,
That's
and
it.
you're finding a clique that you want online,
it.
and it's just
Yeah. So the incel, the involuntary celibate movement is fascinating because that's exactly what's happening. And these guys that are angry because they are not having sex, because they don't know that maybe a relationship starts by talking, and they have never developed that skill. So they all find each other online, and then it goes into this fantasy violence and retribution, and the calls for murder, and venerating the other guys that they call incel saints. And you don't have any corrective voices. You don't have friends who are
none.
saying, hey guys, chill, this isn't normal, stop it. Maybe there's another way to get a girlfriend here. You don't have to go down this path.
I'm not a proponent of prostitution, but if a male hasn't had sex and he's getting towards the point where he's ready to murder people on it, why wouldn't you just go see a prostitute?
That would be a more functional choice. Yeah.
Lost. Like, nope, they all hate me. I can't, I just need to go hurt people. It doesn't, just never made sense.
No, and that shows the bizarre level of distortion that people that really may look average outside, but when you get into their thinking and you get into what they're doing online, you see some very strange things. And when you get a chance to look at the book, I do put some case studies in of one guy who had 2 jobs as a high school English teacher and became one of the incel killers in Tallahassee, Florida, and was very bizarre. But externally, he talked himself into 2 jobs at a high school. So
that's crazy.
It's the internet is such a weird thing. So you're talking about 8chan a minute ago here, and I'm not like super active in forums, but I kept hearing about 8chan and 4chan. So I went to 4chan specifically, and I just browsed through it, and it is the strangest thing I've ever seen. And what's really messed up is people spend their entire day there consuming this weirdness. If you've never seen it, I can't describe to you how abnormal this place is.
Yeah,
Just
I
feels
joined
odd.
8chan just because I wanted to figure out what was going on. And yeah, it really is. It's surreal. And that's another thing that I think, people who are in the position of making decisions about, do we regulate things online or whatever? It's like, have you been there? Do you know that on 8chan, they were putting links to the live stream of the New Zealand mosque killings? I mean, do you even know that this happens? And I think we need to just educate
They couldn't
people.
even question Mark Zuckerberg.
No, what is the internet? Yeah.
Now that's a good point too, is because I guess nobody technically owns the internet. It's just
Right.
a conglomeration of stuff that's connected. So how do you really police something that it doesn't have a jurisdiction? Because 4chan and 8chan, someone should probably pull the plug.
Yeah, it's
But
been
they're not gonna.
8chan has been pulled, and they were deplatformed because of the shooting specifically, and their specific role in promoting them, and the gamification was all happening on 8chan. So I'm for deplatforming. If it comes to genocide, if it comes to mass murder, if it comes to promoting human trafficking, I'm for deplatforming. Don't give them a microphone. I mean, if people talk about those things in their own homes, I mean, that's their business, right? But I don't know that you need a platform. Fred Brennan, are you familiar with Fred Brennan?
No.
He was he was the founder of 8chan when he was 19. No, he was 19, I think, when he started it. And it was all about free speech. And they ended up with a lot of kiddie porn and all the mass shooting stuff. And he pulled out of it and became a very vocal critic of it. And so he's very eloquent in discussing how his views evolved. It's been a few years, but he's still a really young guy. And he now supports, we've really got to monitor the internet, and we've got to regulate things that are really harmful for people in that way.
I mean, I gotta imagine from a psychosis, like most conversations on the internet, or not most, a lot of conversations on the internet can look pretty strange.
I'll say most for sure.
You know what I mean? Like, if from an outside eye, you can look at a lot of conversations, you're like, what is going on here? This isn't normal. At least with men. I don't know about women.
Well, women have the same kind of thing. If you spend any time on Reddit, which Andy and I do read a lot of Reddit, it's not that different from places like 4chan and 8chan. It's just a little bit more policed by what they call moderators.
Yeah.
So hopefully the moderators of every particular forum have some sanity, but you can join almost any conversation and watch it. Just start scrolling down and watch it devolve into insanity. Yeah. And it's a weird like quirk of human behavior where there's no real consequence for anything they say there. So it just gets out of control incredibly fast.
Yeah, the anonymity is really fueling a lot of bizarre things, because
Absolutely.
People become anybody they want to be. And that's why so many of the mass killers, they look at themselves as losers basically in real life, but on the internet, they're heroes, they're important. And
which makes me wonder with the whole with Meta, and they wanting to create like this virtual world, that's just going to make it worse.
It's going to be really interesting. Did you ever mess around with Second Life about a decade ago?
No,
I know
Jerry
it
and I
is,
are
but
both
I've never
really bad with social media.
Yeah, I never really got into it, so I've never actually even seen it, but I have heard about it a little bit.
Yeah, that was supposed to be the new, the big thing, and I got in there just as kind of a research project and ran around in an avatar for a year or so here and there, but yeah, it's fascinating what people will do when they're anonymous. And
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which I wonder is the whole Meta thing. It's got to crash and burn at some point. Just a disaster.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to visualize what that's gonna look like. My husband is a VR developer, but he's oriented toward health enhancing things. So we work on a lot of projects together, like how to give somebody a virtual environment that's going to reduce their anxiety or help their panic attacks, things that are positive. So
Shavaun, I think that's a pretty good place to leave it off here. And we really appreciate you being on and spreading the message, because it is a serious issue, especially here in the United States. Where can people get your book and read it for themselves?
Basically anywhere books are sold. It's The Minds of Mass Killers, Understanding and Interrupting the Pathway to Violence. So all bookstores, Amazon, however they want to get it.
I also saw that you did some readings on YouTube of your book.
Yeah, there are some videos on YouTube that can be accessed on my website. And there are a variety of ways to get to the website, but probably the easiest is themindsofmasskillers.com. And there are videos, there are chapter excerpts, and I'm happy to answer questions. I'm on Facebook, and, I just hope that whatever people do, they see that we all have the power to make a difference, connect with somebody who's going down the wrong path, and encourage people to reach out and get help.
Well, Grizz, that was pretty heavy. And I learned a lot more than I thought I would. And I didn't realize how much misinformation there was about this topic.
I find it pretty fascinating. You always hear about it being an American thing, but it really happens everywhere. I think last week they had something in Germany.
Yeah.
And they sent in like fucking special forces into those schools.
Yeah. Now our schools are in trouble.
It's just, I think it's, we talked about it in the episode. I think a lot of it comes down to just mental health in America in general. And somewhere along the line, these kids, these boys, all think it's okay at some point to just they're just so angry. I don't understand why.
Yeah. And based on our conversation with Shavaun and, the things that I've seen in the United States, I think we really have a mental health crisis more than anything else. A lot of this is just a symptom.
Oh yeah, we've talked about that many times before.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, a lot of times these kids don't have anyone to actually talk to, or they go online and they just get shit on.
Yeah. But there it is. What else can you say? That's the situation. First step to fixing it is spreading the truth like Siobhan's doing.
Yes.
So go check out her book. It's worth a read.
Thank you again for listening to Beautiful Bastards. New episodes every Monday. Remember to like and subscribe.